There is a knife in Cairo that was not made from anything on this planet. It lies behind glass in the Egyptian Museum, 13 inches of pale metal fitted into a handle of solid gold. Most people walk right past it. They assume it's just another treasure from the tomb of Tutankhamun. It isn't. In 2016, scientists were finally allowed to fire an X-ray beam at the blade, and the machine came back with a number that ended a 90-year argument. The metal in that dagger contains almost 11% nickel. No iron ore on Earth produces that. Only one thing in the known universe does: iron meteorites. The blade, buried against the thigh of a teenage pharaoh, was hammered out of a rock that fell from space. That is not a theory. That is a published, peer-reviewed measurement. The boy king was buried holding a piece of the sky. And here's the part that should stop you cold. When that dagger was forged, nobody on Earth could make iron. Not Egypt, not anyone. The furnaces didn't exist. The knowledge didn't exist. The Iron Age wouldn't begin for more than a century after Tutankhamun was already sealed in his tomb. Which means someone took a metal that no civilization knew how to work, shaped it into a flawless royal blade, polished it, fitted it with gold and rock crystal, and it has not rusted in 3,300 years. So the real question was never whether the metal came from space. The machines settled that. The real questions are darker. Who forged it? When forging iron was supposed to be impossible? Why did the Egyptians already have a name for this metal? A name that proves they knew exactly where it came from. And why does a clay tablet, written in a foreign language a generation before Tut was born, describe this exact dagger as a gift from another kingdom? By the end of this, you're going to see that the strangest thing about the space dagger isn't the space part. It's the trail of evidence showing that Bronze Age people understood something about the sky that we assumed they couldn't. Let's start with the blade itself, because how it was found is almost as strange as what it's made of. The dagger wasn't lying in a treasure chest. It was hidden on the body. In 1925, 3 years after Howard Carter first broke through the sealed doorway of Tomb KV-62 in the Valley of the Kings, his team began the slow, careful unwrapping of the mummy itself. Layer by layer, they pulled back the resin-soaked linen. Inside the wrappings, they found over 140 objects placed directly against the king's skin. Amulets, collars, rings, and 2 daggers. One had a blade of solid gold, and it was placed on the king's abdomen. The other was placed along his right thigh, positioned where a warrior would draw it. That second blade was iron. Think about what that placement means. Gold was everywhere in that tomb. The coffin alone was 110 kilograms of it. Gold was the flesh of the gods, but it was not rare to a pharaoh. The iron dagger, though, was wrapped against his body, on his sword hand side, closer to the king in death than almost anything he owned. In the 14th century BCE, iron was not a cheap metal. It was the rarest substance in the ancient world. Surviving trade records from the era price it at up to 8 times the value of gold. This wasn't a weapon. It was the crown jewel of the burial, and the Egyptians hid it under the bandages. For decades, that blade was a problem no one could solve. Tutankhamun died around 1323 BCE. The Iron Age, the moment humans finally learned to pull iron out of ore with high-temperature smelting, doesn't begin until roughly 1200 BCE. The dagger predates humanity's iron technology by more than a century, and it predates Egypt's iron industry by far longer because Egypt was slow to adopt smelting and didn't develop serious iron production for centuries after that. By every rule of the technological timeline, the object should not exist. In 1970, researchers ran a preliminary X-ray test on the blade and picked up unusually high nickel. The result was suggestive, but the technology was crude, the data was disputed, and the full analysis was never properly published. The finding just sat there for decades. the most famous iron object on Earth, and no one could say what it actually was, because the Egyptian authorities were extremely protective of the dagger and would not allow the kind of testing that required touching it, cutting it, or moving it abroad. The blade stayed behind glass, and the question stayed open for 46 years. Then, in 2016, an Italian and Egyptian team led by Dr. Daniele Comelli of the Polytechnic University of Milan got permission to do something new, a technique called X-ray fluorescence spectrometry. No cutting, no sampling, no damage. You fire X-rays at the metal, and the atoms inside answer back, each element glowing at its own signature energy. It is, in the most literal sense, a machine that makes matter confess what it's made of. The blade confessed. Iron, with 10.8% nickel and 0.58% cobalt. The team compared those numbers against the chemical profiles of known iron meteorites, and the dagger fell squarely inside the meteorite range. Terrestrial iron, the kind smelted from ore, almost never carries more than a few percent nickel. Iron meteorites, the shattered cores of ancient protoplanets that broke apart in the early solar system, run from 5% nickel up past 30. The cobalt ratio matched too. And that matters, because the nickel to cobalt ratio in meteoritic iron reflects the chemistry of the early solar system itself. It's a fingerprint that can't be faked by any ore deposit on Earth. The paper was published in the journal Meteoritics and Planetary Science, and the conclusion was blunt. The blade of Tutankhamun's dagger is meteoritic iron, metal that condensed inside the core of a destroyed planetary body over 4.5 billion years ago, drifted through space for eons, and then fell, burning through Earth's atmosphere. That's the first clue, and it answers the title's question. The metal is from outer space, full stop. But the measurement only opened the door, because the moment you accept that the blade is a meteorite, you inherit a much harder problem. Meteoritic iron is one of the most difficult metals an ancient smith could ever face. And that's where the story stops being about chemistry and starts being about a lost skill. Here's the problem. You can't just melt a meteorite and pour a dagger. High nickel iron is notoriously hard, brittle at the edges, and prone to cracking when hammered cold. Working it into a long, thin, symmetrical, structurally perfect blade requires controlled hot forging at exactly the right temperatures, again and again, without splitting the metal. Modern blacksmiths who attempt it describe meteoric iron as brutally unforgiving. Yet, the dagger in Cairo is not a crude lump. Researchers who examined it described an expertly manufactured blade, smooth, even, finely finished, tapering to a fine point, with a homogeneity that stunned the analysts. The 2016 scans found the composition consistent across the whole blade. No cracks, no cold shuts, no patched failures. And consider the rest of the object. The hilt is fine gold, decorated with granulation and cloisonné work. The pommel is carved rock crystal. The gold sheath is embossed with a pattern of feathers and lilies, ending in the head of a jackal. Every part of it is master craftsmanship. Whoever commissioned this treated the metal as the centerpiece, the thing worth wrapping in gold. Whoever made it wasn't experimenting. They had done this before. Somewhere in the late Bronze Age world, there was a workshop that had mastered a metal the rest of humanity wouldn't touch for another century, and history has no record of who they were. But before we hunt for the maker, there's a second clue, and it's written into the Egyptian language itself. Because the Egyptians didn't just own sky metal. They knew it was sky metal. And they told us. For most of the 20th century, scholars translated Egyptian references to iron and kept tripping over a strange phrase that appears in texts from the 13th century BCE onward. 3 hieroglyphs read as Baya en Pet. Translated literally, it means iron from the sky. For decades, Egyptologists dismissed it as symbolic, poetic language, they said. The Egyptians thought the sky was made of iron, or they were calling the metal a gift from the gods, heavenly in the vague, flattering way that everything royal was heavenly. Not a myth. not a metaphor. That's exactly the mistake this channel exists to correct. Because ancient people were usually far more literal than we give them credit for. Look at the timing. The phrase, iron from the sky, enters the Egyptian vocabulary in the 19th dynasty, right around the era of Tutankhamun's dynasty, and immediately after it. And what do we find in the archaeological record just before that? Iron objects whose chemistry is exclusively meteoritic. In 1911, excavators at a prehistoric cemetery in Gerzeh, south of Cairo, found 9 small tube-shaped iron beads strung among gold and gemstones in graves dated to around 3200 BCE. That's 5,200 years ago, 2 millennia before Tutankhamun, in a culture that predates the pharaohs themselves. For a century, those beads were an anomaly. Then, in 2013, researchers scanned them with electron microscopy and neutron-based analysis. High nickel, meteoritic, the oldest iron artifacts in Egypt, among the oldest ever found anywhere, were hammered and rolled from a fallen meteorite before Egypt had even unified as a kingdom. Put those two facts side by side. For 2,000 years, every scrap of iron the Egyptians ever handled came from meteorites, because there was no other source on Earth they could access. And then, at the exact point in history when their texts start naming the metal, they name it iron from the sky. They weren't guessing, they were recording. A civilization we call pre-scientific had correctly identified the extraterrestrial origin of meteoritic iron more than 3,000 years before Western science accepted that stones could fall from the sky at all. And to be clear how embarrassing that comparison is, when peasants in France reported a meteorite fall in 1768, the leading scientists of the Enlightenment investigated and concluded that rocks falling from the sky were impossible. The Egyptians had it right in the Bronze Age. Paris got it wrong in the Age of Reason. And the dagger isn't even the only piece of the sky in that tomb. Among Tutankhamen's jewelry, Carter found a spectacular pectoral, a chest ornament, centered on a carved scarab beetle of pale yellow-green stone. For decades, it was cataloged as chalcedony. It isn't. In the late 1990s, mineralogists identified the material as Libyan desert glass, a natural glass found scattered across a remote stretch of the Sahara near the Egyptian-Libyan border, and formed only one way. Around 29 million years ago, something from space, a meteorite impact or a colossal airburst, flash heated the desert sand to well over 1,000 degrees and fused it into glass. The Egyptians trekked hundreds of kilometers into open desert to collect it, carved it into a sacred scarab, and set it on the king's chest. Count it up. A blade from a fallen star at his thigh. Glass born in a cosmic fireball over his heart. Whether they understood the mechanism or not, the people who dressed this king for eternity wrapped him in materials from the sky, deliberately, on the 2 most protected parts of his body. So the Egyptians knew what the metal was, they treasured it above gold, and they buried their king with it. If you're enjoying how deep this goes, hit subscribe, because this channel investigates cases like this every week, and this one is about to take a turn. Because everything so far assumed the obvious: Egyptian metal, Egyptian smiths, Egyptian dagger. And in 2022, a team of scientists in Japan found evidence, hiding in plain sight, on the handle, that the most famous Egyptian artifact of the 20th century might not be Egyptian at all. Here's where it gets strange. After the 2016 study confirmed the meteorite, a team at the Chiba Institute of Technology, led by planetary scientists Takafumi Matsui and Tomoko Arai, traveled to Cairo in February 2020 and re-examined the dagger with high-resolution imaging and their own chemical scans. They confirmed the nickel, measuring it at 11.8%. But then they photographed the surface of the blade under precise conditions, and they saw something no one had documented before: a faint, cross-hatched, crystalline texture running through the metal. Metallurgists know the texture instantly. It's called a Widmanstatten pattern, an interlocking lattice of two different iron-nickel alloys, kamacite and taenite, that forms only one way, inside the core of an asteroid, as molten metal cools at a rate of roughly 1 degree every 1,000 years, over millions of years. No furnace, no forge, no human process can create it. It is the unforgeable signature of deep space, and it was still visible on the blade of a pharaoh's dagger. That pattern told them two things. First, the exact type of meteorite. Only one class of iron meteorite carries that structure with that nickel content, a group called octahedrites. Second, and this is the remarkable part, the pattern told them how the dagger was made. Widmanstatten structure is destroyed by heat. Raise the metal above roughly 950 degrees Celsius, the normal working temperature for forging, and the crystal lattice dissolves forever. The pattern survived, which means the smith who made this dagger deliberately worked the meteorite at low temperature, hot enough to shape it, never hot enough to erase its internal structure. The team also found small black spots scattered across the blade, rich in sulfur. Those are the remnants of troilite, an iron sulfide mineral that occurs as inclusions inside iron meteorites. Another fingerprint, still intact. This wasn't luck. This was a smith operating inside a narrow temperature window that modern metallurgists map with instruments, and doing it by eye, by feel, by inherited knowledge 33 centuries ago. So, who had that knowledge? Not Egypt. There is no evidence of any iron forging tradition in Egypt in the 14th century BCE. None. And this is where the Japanese team noticed the detail that changes the whole story. They scanned the gold hilt, the handle, and found something chemically wrong with it. The decorative inlays on the hilt were glued in place with an adhesive containing calcium but no sulfur. That composition means lime plaster. And here's the problem. Egyptians didn't use lime plaster. Egyptian craftsmen used gypsum plaster, which is loaded with sulfur, and they kept using gypsum for another 1,000 years. Lime plaster doesn't appear in Egyptian workshops until the Ptolemaic period, around 300 BCE. But there was a place where lime plaster was standard technology in Tutankhamun's era, the kingdoms to the northeast, Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, the land of the Hittites, and a kingdom called Mitanni. Hold that thought, because now a clay tablet enters the story, and it's the biggest reveal of this entire investigation. In 1887, an Egyptian woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of Amarna uncovered a cache of nearly 400 clay tablets. They turned out to be the diplomatic archive of the Egyptian royal court, letters between the pharaohs and the kings of the ancient Near East, written in Akkadian, the international language of the age. Scholars call them the Amarna letters, and they are the oldest surviving records of international diplomacy on Earth. Among them is a document catalogued as EA-22. It is an inventory, a dowry list, sent by King Tushratta of Mitanni to Pharaoh Amenhotep III, on the occasion of the pharaoh marrying Tushratta's daughter. And in that list, sitting among the chariots and the gold and the horses, is this item. One dagger with a blade of iron, its hilt of gold, decorated with inlays of genuine lapis lazuli. An iron dagger with a gold hilt, with inlaid decoration, sent from Mitanni, a kingdom sitting in exactly the region where lime plaster was used and where early ironworking skills existed, to Amenhotep III. And who was Amenhotep III, Tutankhamun's grandfather? Read that chain of evidence again, because each link was discovered independently, decades apart, by different fields of science. The blade is meteoritic iron, forged with a low-temperature technique unknown in Egypt. The hilt is assembled with an adhesive that no Egyptian workshop used, but foreign workshops did. And a 3,400-year-old customs document records an iron dagger with a gold hilt entering Egypt as a royal wedding gift, into the hands of Tut's own grandfather, roughly a generation before the boy was buried, with an iron dagger with a gold hilt. The Egyptologist Christine Lilliquist of the Metropolitan Museum of Art proposed as far back as 1999 that the dagger in the tomb and the dagger in the letter might be the same object. In 2022, the physical evidence finally caught up with her. Not similar, not inspired by it, possibly the same knife. And the wider records back it up. Iron was so scarce in this era that kings wrote to each other begging for it. In a later letter from the Hittite archives, a Hittite king, most scholars believe Hattusili III, responds to a foreign ruler's request for iron by apologizing that his storehouse has none ready, that it is a bad time for producing good iron, and promising to send what he can, enclosing a single iron dagger blade as a gesture. Read that again. The most powerful empires on Earth, negotiating over one blade at a time. That was the world this dagger moved through. A world where iron wasn't a commodity. It was a message between kings. If that identification is right, then the object against Tutankhamun's thigh wasn't just space metal. It was a family heirloom, a piece of superpower diplomacy, forged from a fallen star in a foreign kingdom, carried across the ancient world as the ultimate royal gift, handed down from grandfather to father to a boy who died at 19, and then hidden inside his wrappings for eternity. The most personal object in the most famous tomb on Earth may not even be Egyptian. And there's one more layer. The dagger wasn't alone. Carter's team found other iron in the tomb. A miniature headrest amulet of iron, an amulet on an iron blade, and a set of 16 small iron blades, model tools. Analysis suggests meteoritic origins across the group. But here's the strange contrast. Most of those pieces are crudely worked, almost amateurish, nothing like the dagger's perfection, which fits the theory perfectly. The rough pieces look like early Egyptian attempts to work a metal they barely understood. The dagger looks like the product of a mature foreign workshop. 2 skill levels, 1 tomb. Now, you might expect that an object this important would have been studied to exhaustion decades ago. It wasn't, and the reasons are worth pausing on. After the disputed 1970 test, the dagger effectively went dark for nearly half a century. Requests to analyze it went nowhere. It was displayed, photographed, admired, and never scientifically characterized, because authorities would not permit sampling and the non-invasive technology either didn't exist or wasn't approved. A blade that rewrites the timeline of metallurgy sat in a case for 46 years while the argument about it ran on assumptions. Even the 2016 was only allowed to scan it, never to move it or touch its surface with anything invasive. And the deeper questions, like tracing the exact parent meteorite, would require analysis that has still never been authorized. In 2016, researchers pointed to a candidate, a meteorite called Kharga, found in 2000 on a limestone plateau near Mersa Matruh, west of Alexandria, with nickel and cobalt values close to the blade. It has never been confirmed, because confirming it would mean comparing trace element fingerprints at a precision the approved scans can't reach, and no one has been allowed to go further. Meanwhile, the 2022 team pointed the other direction entirely, toward a meteorite that fell somewhere in Anatolia or Mesopotamia and was forged abroad. 2 peer-reviewed studies, 2 different continents of origin, 1 blade. The crater, the fall site, the parent rock of the most famous knife on Earth. All of it remains unidentified. The trail ends where the permits end. Now, does any of this prove the most extreme version of the story? The one where ancient astronaut theorists tell you the dagger is evidence of alien gifts or lost super civilizations? Probably not. And this is where we slow down and be honest, because the grounded explanation is on the table and it deserves a fair hearing. Nothing about this dagger requires anything other than human beings. Meteorites fall. Iron meteorites are visibly metallic, and a Bronze Age person who found one held a ready-made lump of workable metal that needed no smelting, no ore, no furnace revolution, just skill and patience. Kingdoms like Mitanni and the Hittites sat closer to the regions where early iron experimentation was happening. So it makes sense that they, not Egypt, produced the masterpiece. The prestige economy explains the rest. When a metal is 8 times the price of gold, kings send it to other kings, and pharaohs take it to their graves. No aliens required. But that grounded explanation has a problem. One loose thread it cannot tie off. If the dagger came from Mitanni, then somewhere under the soil of what is now Syria or southern Turkey, there was a workshop tradition that could hot forge octahedrite meteorites within a precise temperature window, a tradition advanced enough to produce a flawless blade. And that tradition is completely invisible to archaeology. We have never found the workshop. We have never found another blade like it. Mitanni itself was destroyed within a century of the letter. Its capital city, Washukani, erased so thoroughly that archaeologists still argue about where it even was. The people who may have forged the most famous knife in human history are a kingdom we cannot fully locate, working a craft we have no other example of, using a fallen star we have never found. Every answer in this story opens onto a missing chapter. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter in the most literal sense. The neat textbook line, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, hides a stranger truth. For thousands of years before the Iron Age, there was a shadow Iron Age, a thin, precious trickle of metal falling from the sky, collected by people who understood exactly what it was, traded between empires, and worked by a handful of smiths whose skills died with them. The Gerzeh beads, the Anatolian daggers, the 16 rough blades in Tut's tomb, and one perfect knife. That's nearly all that survives of it. How many other fallen stars were found, forged, and lost? How many objects in museum cases right now are mislabeled as ordinary iron because no one has ever pointed an X-ray at them? The dagger is still there, behind glass in Cairo, on a pale cushion, its blade still bright, still unrusted after 33 centuries, still carrying the crystal signature of an asteroid core that cooled for millions of years in the dark between the planets. Somewhere out in the desert, or long since ground to dust, lies the rest of the rock it fell from, never found. And somewhere beneath the plains of the ancient Near East, the forge that shaped it is still buried, still waiting for a shovel that hasn't come. The boy king slept with a piece of the sky against his leg for 3,000 years, and we only just learned how to ask it where it came from. If this is your kind of history, watch the next investigation on screen now. It goes even deeper.